believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I walked into my parents' living room that Sunday afternoon thinking, stupidly, that things would be different this time. That maybe, just maybe, my brother Kyle would act like a grown man for once in his life. I should have known better. There he was, stretched out on the couch like he owned the place, shoes kicked off, legs spread wide, and in his hand, the one thing he should never have touched was my watch. Not just any watch. My limited edition Rolex Daytona, black ceramic bezel, steel and gold two-tone, a piece I'd worked 5 damn years to afford. I bought it for myself after closing the biggest deal of my life. It wasn't just a watch, it was a symbol, a reminder, a middle finger to every doubt I'd swallowed and every "you're too ambitious" that I'd quietly buried with a smile. Kyle held it like it was a gas station toy, dangling it by the bracelet, spinning it like a lasso, then laughing when it slipped through his fingers. The sound it made when it hit the tile still echoes in my head, sharp, final, like a bone breaking. I froze. He laughed. Actually laughed. And then, with that cocky, careless grin he's been wearing since he was 15 and figured out that our parents would never let him face a single real consequence, he said, "Relax, Jenna. Mom and Dad'll replace it anyway." I didn't scream. I didn't lunge across the room or throw a fit like I might have in my 20s. I just looked at him, really looked, and in that moment, something snapped, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't rage. It was clarity. I saw Kyle for exactly who he was, a man-child dressed in 33 years of privilege and denial, someone who'd never had to clean up the messes he made because our parents, God love them, always stepped in and swept the broken glass under someone else's feet. Usually mine. The room fell quiet for a second after he said that. Dad chuckled nervously. Mom looked down at her wine glass like the answer might be floating in it. No one asked if it was okay. No one apologized. They just waited for me to do what I always do. Shrug it off. Be the bigger person. Again. Instead, I knelt down, picked up the watch, turned it over in my hand. The crystal was cracked right across the center, and the second's hand had stopped ticking. And then I smiled, calm, even pleasant, and said, "No worries. I'll send you the repair bill tomorrow." You could almost hear the confusion crawling across Kyle's brain. He looked at me like I'd just started speaking Japanese. "Wait, what?" he said, that familiar scoff already forming, ready to launch into one of his patented rants about how I'm uptight and money-obsessed and whatever other recycled crap he tells himself when someone holds him accountable. I stood up slowly, still holding the watch, and said again, this time more clearly, "You dropped it. You pay for it." He started to laugh, like he thought I was kidding, but I didn't join in. And that's when something shifted. The laughter died in his throat, and for the first time in a long time, Kyle looked unsure of himself. Vulnerable, even. The next morning, as promised, I emailed him the repair estimate from the Rolex service center. It was almost $2,000. Not because I wanted to squeeze him, I didn't make the price up. That's just what it costs to replace the sapphire crystal and recalibrate the movement on a luxury watch. But here's the part he didn't see coming. I'd also attached a copy of the claim I'd filed with my insurance company. In it, I'd listed the cause of damage as third-party negligence, his name, right there in black and white, with the time, date, and location. And that's when the color drained from his face. Now, you might think I was being petty, and maybe I was. But you've got to understand something. This wasn't about the watch. It wasn't about the money either. It was about the decades of crap I'd swallowed, because being the responsible sibling means you're expected to tolerate everything. The messes. The excuses. The endless forgiveness. Kyle had borrowed my car at 17 and totaled it while drunk, and my parents replaced it for me without ever making him apologize. He took my credit card in college to buy books, and racked up charges for video games and fast food, and they paid it off without even asking him to explain. Every single time he screwed up, they covered for him, and they expected me to understand, to let it go, to be the good example. But I was done. This time, I wanted the system to hold him the way I'd always had to. And if that meant being the villain in my parents' eyes, then so be it. I'd rather be the villain with dignity than the saint covered in bruises no one ever talks about. That night, I got a text from Kyle. It just said, "Are you serious right now?" I didn't reply. Instead, I printed out the insurance documentation, slid it into an envelope, and dropped it off at my parents' place the next morning during brunch. My mom opened it at the table, her smile wilting when she saw what was inside. Dad didn't say a word. Kyle wasn't even there. By evening, I got the call. It was Kyle. His voice was tight on edge. "Why would you file an insurance claim?" he asked, trying to sound calm but failing. "Because that's what you do when something valuable gets damaged due to someone else's negligence," I said. "Isn't that what you told me when you broke my laptop and said I should have insured it?" He went quiet. "Then, this could screw up my credit." "That's not my problem," I said, keeping my voice even. "Maybe next time, don't drop what isn't yours." There was a long pause, the kind where you can practically hear someone trying to figure out which lie to go with. But I didn't give him the chance. "You've been protected your whole life, Kyle," I added. "You've never had to answer for anything. This time, you will." I ended the call and poured myself a glass of wine. The day felt heavier than I expected, not triumphant, exactly, but real. Like I'd finally started to turn a page that had been stuck for far too long. And just as I sat down, the insurance company emailed me back. They were proceeding with the claim and may contact the responsible party for follow-up. I smiled. Kyle had no idea what he'd stepped into. Not yet. But he would. And the best part? I hadn't even started. When I said I'd send Kyle the bill, he thought I was bluffing, just another overreaction from his uptight older sister, the one who always took things too seriously, who always had to be right, who never knew how to just laugh things off and let them slide like he did. But what Kyle never seemed to realize, and what my parents conveniently ignored, was that the only reason I carried myself with so much restraint was because no one ever came to clean up the messes for me. If I didn't pay the bills, they didn't get paid. If I didn't fix it, no one did. There was no safety net waiting to catch me when things fell apart, and the only thing that had ever kept me afloat was my relentless focus, my planning, and my unwillingness to let anyone, especially my brother, decide how my story would end. So no, I wasn't bluffing. I filed the insurance claim 2 days after he dropped the Rolex, submitted all the photos, close-ups of the cracked face, the time-stamped messages, the receipt from the service center. Even a screenshot of Kyle wearing the damn watch from his Instagram story that same day, a stupid grin on his face as he held it up like a prize. I labeled the cause of loss clearly: damage caused by third-party negligence, identified as Kyle Richardson, brother. I even attached a brief incident report stating the location, the date, and a summary of what happened, written as dryly and professionally as I could manage. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I wanted it on record. I wanted it in writing, traceable, undeniable. I wasn't yelling this time. I was documenting. The adjuster called me back within 48 hours. She sounded impressed by the level of detail. "Not many people provide this much evidence," she said, almost with a chuckle. I told her I'd had practice, decades of it, in fact. What Kyle didn't know, and what most people don't until it's too late, is that once a third party is identified as responsible in an insurance claim, their name doesn't just sit there quietly. It gets logged, flagged, sometimes even passed to the insurer's liability team for follow-up. And if they don't respond, or if they deny it without sufficient evidence, it can escalate into a fraud investigation or a collections issue. Not criminal necessarily, not jail time serious, but serious enough to trigger credit report dings, employment screenings, or civil liability notices. Serious enough to be a very real wake-up call. The best part? I didn't have to do any more yelling. I didn't have to argue. The system would take care of it. The paper trail I created, quiet, methodical, unemotional, was the kind of thing that people like Kyle never saw coming, because they were too used to drama being loud and messy, too used to people eventually giving up when things got uncomfortable. And sure enough, the discomfort came knocking quickly. I got a message from Kyle 3 days after the claim was submitted. "This is getting out of hand," he wrote. "We're family. You really think dragging me into insurance paperwork is necessary?" He always used that word, family, like it was some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card, like the blood we shared was supposed to cancel out every careless thing he'd ever done. But I was tired of being told that family means forgiveness without accountability. I wrote back, just one line, "It's not personal, Kyle, it's just procedure." He didn't reply. That same evening, Mom called. She started with small talk, how work was going, if I was still seeing Terry, whether I'd made a dentist appointment for that wisdom tooth I kept putting off, but it didn't take long for her to slide into the real reason for the call. "Your brother's upset," she said, in that carefully neutral tone she used whenever she was about to defend him, but didn't want to sound like she was defending him. "He said you filed something with your insurance company and that it's affecting his records." I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to feel the silence. And when I did speak, my voice was steady, low, and unapologetic. He dropped a $5,000 watch and laughed about it. I gave him every chance to do the right thing, and he didn't take it. Now the consequences are out of my hands. There was a pause on the other end, and then, like clockwork, came the sigh. "I just think this is getting a little dramatic." I had to laugh. Not loudly, not cruelly, just one of those tired, bitter little laughs that escapes when someone says something so ironic it almost feels like a joke. "You know what's dramatic, Mom? Having your property broken and being told to relax because someone else will clean up the mess. That's dramatic. This is paperwork." She didn't have much to say after that. She mumbled something about how maybe Dad could help pay the bill, and I stopped her cold. "No, he won't. This is between me and Kyle. He's not 10 anymore." What I didn't say, but what I knew she understood, was that I wasn't just filing a claim on a watch. I was filing a claim on years of unequal treatment, on all the times I'd been expected to carry the weight without ever dropping it, while Kyle stumbled through life with a net made of lowered expectations and soft landings. I was filing a claim on the system itself, and I was done pretending it didn't need fixing. The next day, the insurance adjuster emailed again. They had attempted to reach Kyle but received no response. If he didn't reply within 72 hours, the case would move to the next stage, collections. I forwarded that email to Kyle with a short note, "TikTok." He read it. Didn't reply. I could almost hear the panic brewing. Because Kyle didn't know how to navigate systems like this. He'd never had to learn. He was the kind of guy who thought consequences only existed in theory, who believed sorry fixed everything, who thought the world would always bend to meet him halfway. But now, the world wasn't bending. And the real irony? If he'd just taken responsibility from the beginning, if he'd just said, "I'm sorry," pulled out his wallet, and paid for the repair, none of this would have happened. But he didn't. And now, it wasn't just about the watch anymore. It was about the record. And that record had his name on it. The thing about family is that it has a strange way of pretending fairness exists, while quietly shifting the balance until one person is always left holding the weight, biting their tongue, and being told they're too sensitive when they finally speak up. And in my family, that person was always me. I had grown up believing that being the older sibling meant leading by example, staying composed when everything around me slipped into chaos, and swallowing the bitter pills of injustice with a smile simply because that's just how Kyle is. My brother, the charming disaster, the golden boy with a crooked halo, always got the benefit of the doubt while I was expected to be understanding, patient, and endlessly forgiving. And for years, I played along, telling myself that eventually, things would balance out, that being the responsible one would someday pay off, even if just in peace of mind. But peace never came, only more silence, more apologies I never received, and more boundaries I wasn't allowed to have. After the insurance claim had been filed and the clock had started ticking on Kyle's failure to respond, the air around me began to change, not physically, but atmospherically. There was a tension in every interaction now, as if my decision to stop cleaning up Kyle's messes had torn a seam in the family fabric, and nobody knew how to stitch it without blaming me for pulling the thread. The silence was no longer benign. It had weight. It had judgment. And most of all, it had expectation that I would cave, that I would make it easy again. But I didn't. And it didn't take long for the first attempt to reel me back in to arrive, dressed in guilt and faux concern, delivered, of course, by my mother. She called one evening just after dinner, her voice soft, almost trembling, which I recognized not as fear, but as performance. She started with concern for me, how stressed I must be, how she hoped this situation wasn't causing tension between me and Terry, how maybe it would be better for everyone if we just moved on. The implication was clear. I was making things worse by not letting it go. That's always how it worked. When Kyle screwed up, the cleanup wasn't his responsibility. It became mine the moment I refused to pretend it didn't happen. "Your brother's been really upset," she said gently, as though that somehow made his actions less offensive, as though his discomfort deserved more compassion than my property being broken and my boundaries trampled. I asked her, calmly, was he upset when he dropped the watch? When he laughed about it? There was silence for a moment, the kind where I could practically hear her deciding how honest she wanted to be. "He didn't mean anything by it," she finally said, and that was the phrase that did it, that old, tired, infuriating phrase that had been used to excuse everything from broken promises to ruined birthdays. "He didn't mean anything by it." "Well, intent doesn't glue the glass back together," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended but far calmer than I felt. "Intent doesn't pay the repair bill. Intent doesn't change the fact that he never apologized." Mom sighed, a sound so familiar I could predict the next words. "He's just going through a lot right now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask if they had ever, just once, stopped to wonder what I was going through when I had to cancel my honeymoon to cover the deductible for Kyle's last accident. Or when I spent Christmas morning replacing gifts he'd sold for quick cash during his post-college unemployment spiral. But I didn't scream. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I said, "He's 33, Mom. At what point does he start going through things on his own without dragging everyone else down with him?" She didn't answer, not directly, but she made one final offer, one last attempt to put a bow on the broken. She and Dad would pay the bill, just to smooth things over, just to make this go away. But that offer, kind as it may have sounded, felt more like a bribe than a gesture of peace. It was a plea for silence, a financial bandage on a gaping emotional wound, and I refused to accept it. "This isn't about the money anymore," I said, and I meant it. "This is about the fact that no one ever holds Kyle accountable, and I'm not going to be part of that cycle anymore." The silence that followed was long, and unlike the others, this one felt final. I could feel her disappointment radiating through the phone, not because Kyle had caused damage, but because I had finally refused to pretend it didn't matter. That night, I received a message from Kyle, not a voicemail, not a call, just a text, short and vague and full of that same passive-aggressive energy he always used when he felt cornered. It read, "Wow. Really? You're gonna ruin everything over a watch." I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen, rereading those words, each one revealing just how little he understood. It wasn't over a watch. It was over being treated like I was disposable. Like my things, my time, my respect didn't matter unless I forced them to. Eventually, I replied, "It's not just the watch. It's every time you've broken something and expected me to pick up the pieces." He didn't answer. The next morning, I got another email from the insurance company. Kyle still hadn't responded. The claim was now moving forward with a third-party review, and if he continued to ignore the correspondence, the insurer reserved the right to pursue recovery through collections or litigation. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just sat at my kitchen counter, sipping cold coffee, staring at the words on the screen, and realizing how exhausting it was to finally start demanding justice, even in the smallest, most technical way. But I also felt something else, something heavier and more complicated: guilt. Not because I was wrong, but because I was finally doing something right, and it meant breaking the illusion of peace my family had clung to for years. And somewhere deep inside, a part of me wondered whether standing my ground meant losing more than just my patience. Maybe I was risking the last thread holding us all together. But if that thread was made of silence and one-sided loyalty, maybe it needed to snap. Because if blood always comes with conditions, then maybe it's not love. Maybe it's just control. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Kyle finally cracked, not the loud, emotional explosion I half expected from him, not a dramatic meltdown or storm of insults, but something quieter, more controlled, and far more dangerous. His voice on the phone that day was different, measured, restrained, even polite in a way that immediately made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Because when someone like Kyle suddenly shifts from arrogance to civility, it's never about remorse, it's strategy. He wasn't sorry. He was calculating. And what he was calculating, I would soon realize, wasn't just how to fix the mess he'd made, but how to spin it so that the blame, once again, slid off his shoulders and landed squarely on mine. "Hey," he said, like we were two siblings catching up after a vacation, like the last 3 weeks hadn't been a slow-motion collapse of every unspoken rule our family had depended on for decades. I wanted to talk. "Can we meet in person? Just the two of us?" For a second, I considered saying no, considered letting the process play out with cold professionalism and well-timed emails, considered refusing him the intimacy of face-to-face negotiation because he didn't deserve that privilege anymore. But something in me, a mix of curiosity and the lingering ghost of obligation, agreed. Maybe I needed to see the performance up close, maybe I needed to watch the mask slip in real time, or maybe, on some level I wasn't proud of, I still hoped for honesty. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments, neutral ground with soft lighting and too much noise for any real confrontation. Kyle was already there when I arrived, seated near the back, looking like he hadn't slept much, dark circles under his eyes, fingers drumming on the table like he was trying to tap out a script he hadn't memorized. He stood when I walked in, gave a weak smile, and gestured for me to sit. I didn't return the smile, didn't say anything unnecessary. I just sat down, folded my arms, and waited. So he began, leaning forward like we were co-conspirators and not opposing parties in a slow-burning war. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and about the claim. I know I screwed up. I know I shouldn't have touched your watch, let alone dropped it." I said nothing. Let the silence thicken. "And I know I laughed," he continued, glancing down at his coffee like maybe it could save him, which was wrong. "I was being stupid, and I didn't think it was that big of a deal." There it was still, after all this time, he didn't think it was that big of a deal. Not because the watch wasn't valuable, not because it hadn't been mine, not because he didn't know better, but because the idea of consequences still felt foreign to him. He was saying the right words, but the core remained unchanged. He didn't truly feel the weight of what he'd done, only the weight of the repercussions. "I just think," he said, eyes finally lifting to meet mine, "that this whole insurance thing is getting out of hand. I mean, they're calling me, sending letters. I can't have that stuff showing up on my record. What if my company sees it?" I leaned back, tilting my head, studying him. "Then maybe you should have paid the repair bill and taken accountability when I gave you the chance." He blinked, as if genuinely surprised I wasn't meeting him halfway, as if the mere fact that he'd sat down and admitted fault, even in this lukewarm, self-serving way, should have been enough to earn my forgiveness. "I'm just saying," he added, frustration starting to bubble up, "this could really screw things up for me. Can't you just retract it?" That word, retract, landed on me like a slap. He spoke of it like I had posted a rumor or made a social faux pas, like I had created something fictional that could be undone with a single phone call. But I hadn't lied. I hadn't exaggerated. I had told the truth, and now he wanted me to pretend it hadn't happened just because he didn't like the outcome. "No," I said, flatly, firmly. "I'm not retracting anything." He leaned in then, lowering his voice, and what came next wasn't a plea, it was a warning. "You know, if this gets out, if it ends up on my record or gets flagged somewhere, it's not just me who looks bad. It's the whole family. I mean, what are people gonna think if they find out you went after your own brother like this over a watch?" I didn't blink. "They'll think I finally stood up for myself." That's when he switched tactics, the smirk curling back into place like an old habit. "You've always been like this, you know. Overdramatic. Obsessed with control. You love turning everything into a court case." And maybe that was the moment I realized just how deep his entitlement ran, because even now, even facing consequences he didn't know how to escape, he couldn't admit that the real issue wasn't my reaction, but his action. He couldn't see that I wasn't pressing charges out of spite, but rather documenting behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. "I've got evidence," I said calmly, pulling out a small folder I'd brought with me, the edges neat, the pages printed. The insurance company asked for photos, records, timestamps. I gave them everything. You know what else I included? That Instagram story you posted, the one where you held up my watch and said, "Look what I found lying around." You were showing off. And then you dropped it. It's all there, Kyle. His face drained of color as I slid the folder across the table. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. That story had a timestamp, I added. It proves you were holding it. Proves you knew what you were doing. Proves negligence. He didn't say a word. For the first time in weeks, Kyle was truly speechless. You said I was overreacting, I continued, my voice quiet but sharp, but what I did was react finally, after years of being expected to let things go. He sat back, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowing. You wouldn't really go through with this, he said. And I smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough to show him I was done playing the game. You dropped the watch, I said. I just dropped the act. When I stood up to leave, I felt his eyes follow me, but he didn't call out, didn't chase after me, didn't offer one last apology to make it all go away. Because for the first time in his life, Kyle understood that he'd gone too far and that I wasn't coming back to fix it. The funny thing about justice, real justice, not the kind that gets wrapped in holiday dinners and birthday cards with forced smiles, is that when it finally arrives, it doesn't look like triumph or catharsis or even relief. It looks like quiet, like stillness, like a kind of hollow that no one prepares you for, especially when the victory comes not with applause or recognition, but with silence and averted eyes. I thought that standing up to Kyle would make me feel powerful, that making him face the consequences he'd always dodged would feel like reclaiming something that had been taken from me piece by piece, year after year. And in some ways, it did. But what I hadn't prepared for, what no one tells you about being the one who finally says enough, is that the truth doesn't just set you free, it also isolates you. The day after our meeting at the coffee shop, the insurance company sent me their final decision. The claim had been reviewed, accepted, and marked for third-party liability. Kyle would be issued a formal notification, and if payment wasn't received by the deadline, the matter would be referred to a collections agency. Simple. Clean. No emotion. Just process. I stared at the email longer than I needed to, reading each line like it might change the second time around, like maybe it would deliver some message I hadn't yet understood. But there it was, plain and final. The system had done what I'd asked it to do. And yet, I didn't feel the surge of validation I'd expected. Instead, I felt like I was standing in the middle of a house that had just been leveled, safe, unharmed, but surrounded by rubble that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. That weekend, I got a text from my father, not long, not emotional, just a sentence that landed like a slap. "We need to talk about what you're doing to this family." It was such a familiar phrase, such a predictable shift in narrative, that I almost laughed. Because even now, after all this, the story wasn't about what Kyle had done, or what I had tolerated for years, or even the fact that a $5,000 watch had been broken and dismissed like a dollar store trinket. It was about how my refusal to let it slide was somehow the real crime. I didn't reply right away. I let it sit there, unread, while I poured myself a drink and walked around the apartment in silence, trying to figure out if this was what it meant to finally break the cycle. I thought about every moment that had led to this, every time I'd said yes when I should have said no, every holiday gathering where Kyle's recklessness was passed off as charm, every time my parents looked at me with pride in public and disappointment in private. Like I was too cold, too hard, too unwilling to be the peacekeeper they needed. And I realized something then. Something that had been growing in me since the second Kyle dropped that watch. This wasn't about revenge. It never really was. It was about dignity. About claiming the right to be angry when someone disrespected me. About refusing to let family ties be used as a leash. And yet, the cost of that dignity was becoming clear. When the collections notice was officially issued, I forwarded it to Kyle without commentary. I didn't need to say anything. The documents spoke for themselves, clear, official, legal. He read them. I could see the read receipts. He didn't respond. And within 48 hours, I received another call, not from him this time, but from my mother. Her voice was colder now, clipped, like she had rehearsed every word in front of a mirror, practicing how to sound disappointed without sounding cruel. "Your brother's reputation could be permanently damaged," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "His employer is starting to ask questions." I asked her, just once, "Do you even care what this has cost me?" She hesitated just for a beat, and then said, "This isn't about you." And that was the moment everything solidified. Not the moment Kyle dropped the watch. Not the day I filed the claim. Not even the meeting at the coffee shop where he tried to manipulate me into silence. It was this moment, this one casual, brutal sentence from the woman who had raised me, that finally made it all click. Because it was always going to come back to that. It was always going to come back to me being the difficult one, the stubborn one, the one who didn't know how to let things go. And I realized, with a clarity so sharp it felt like breaking glass, that they were never going to see it any other way. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just hung up the phone and deleted the voicemail that followed. I didn't need to hear it to know what it said. I'd already lived it. In the end, I withdrew the claim, not because I was caving, not because I forgave him, but because I had already won in the only way that mattered. Kyle's name was now flagged in the insurance company's system, marked as a third-party liable for damages. That note wouldn't vanish, not with a retraction, not with any apology. It would follow him quietly, in background checks and risk assessments, in ways he wouldn't fully understand until it mattered most. I didn't need the money. I needed the record. A few days later, the watch came back from the service center. The repair was immaculate, the crystal restored, the movement reset, the face polished so precisely that, to anyone else, it looked brand new. But I could still see it. A barely there hairline scar beneath the surface, just a whisper of the crack that once ran through the heart of it. Most people would never notice. But I would. Every time I looked at it, I'd remember not the moment it broke, but the moment I decided I wouldn't pretend it didn't matter. Terry, ever the quiet observer, looked at the watch in my hand that night and said, "You gonna wear it again?" I smiled, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with something deeper. "Yeah," I said, "because now it means something else." And that was the truth. The Rolex used to be a symbol of achievement, of hard work, of having finally arrived. But now it was something more. It was a reminder that silence is not strength, that boundaries matter even when they hurt, and that sometimes doing the right thing costs you the very people who told you they loved you unconditionally. And maybe that's the hardest part. Because when it comes to family, people love to say that blood is thicker than water. But no one ever talks about how hard it is to clean up the stains once it's been spilled.